What's going on, Hawks fans? It's Atlanta basketball with Caleb Johnson, episode 2. And hopefully, you've gone back and listened to episode 1. You're following, you're subscribing, you're doing all of the things that make my bosses happy in order to get this content. There's been a lot that's happened since the last time that we talked, and that's because there was an NBA draft. There was free agency opening and beginning and getting underway and causing a ton of chaos in the world of the NBA. So we're going to catch up with all of those things over the course of this episode. Also, I'm going to have a conversation with Asa Newell, the Atlanta Hawks their first round picked at number 23 this past NBA draft. Spoiler there. If you didn't know, Asa Newell out of Georgia is the new Hawks draft pick. I had a conversation with him at his introductory press conference that I'll have for you later in the show. But let's first begin kind of where things left off as we talked about GM Onsi Saleh being a guy who had a lot of expectations, I believe, of kind of where this draft would go, how he would go about attacking free agency. And then we've gotten to see his work in play. There was some conversation about whether Onsi Saleh would be the guy in charge. And that's simply because the Hawks told us they were going to hire a president of basketball operations. They have not done so. And I was one who said early on, I wasn't so sure that they were going to because of the glowing reviews that Onsi Saleh had coming out of Golden State and previously spending some time with the Spurs. And then a guy like Masai Ujiri pops up right after the NBA draft as he was let go by the Raptors after they drafted, which seems insane. Not something you don't normally see in this NBA climate, but we've also seen coaches now get fired right before the playoffs and advance pretty well, like we saw with the Denver Nuggets. So anything can happen. One of the best players in the NBA can get traded, as we've seen with Luka Doncic. So all of these things can kind of go on at any point, and you just gotta keep with it and kind of follow things as they are. But for now, and as I fully anticipate to see moving forward, Onsi Saleh is the guy in charge, and he is someone who is gaining a lot of fans very quickly because of the moves that he's making. And it started last week with the fact that the Hawks traded with the Boston Celtics. It was actually a 3-team trade in order to get Kristaps Porzingis. I told you on the last episode going into the draft, I did not think that the Hawks wanted to take 13 and 22. And in fact, they took neither 13 or 22, as we'll get into within this episode. But taking Kristaps Porzingis is adding veteran leadership and ability to this team that was already really young. And when you're trying to build a championship contending roster, you want to have youth. You certainly want to have youth. And we saw the Oklahoma City Thunder be a team that was so young that when it came time to pop champagne, they literally didn't know what to do. So youth is clearly important, but you don't want to go too young. And I think Onsi Saleh realized that with the Hawks. And so he took the 22nd pick that the Hawks had acquired as a part of the DeJounte Murray trade with the Pelicans that got them Dyson Daniels and the 22nd overall pick in this year's NBA draft. He packaged that together with Terrence Mann and with George Niang, included the Brooklyn Nets as a part of this deal, and made a deal happen where you get Kristaps Porzingis, a guy who, yes, it's going to be talked ad nauseum about his injury history, and the injury history is there, where the man has not played a full NBA season in like 8 seasons, I think, something like that, and hasn't really played close to a full season since he was in a contract year with the Washington Wizards. All of that being aside, like when you're making moves in order to improve your team, you're taking on some sort of risk. And the risk that the Hawks are willing to take on this time is, in order for us to get Kristaps Porzingis, we're going to have to deal with the risk of his injury history, because he is 7'2". He is a guy who blocks a ton of shots, and he can stretch the floor and shoot outside the arc. And so all of those things are things that the Atlanta Hawks needed. And they got that. Now it goes into the conversations that are always going to be fun and interesting to have as to who is going to start in Atlanta. But I certainly think the most pressing issue kind of happening is the simple fact that you improved your team. You gave up George Niang and Terrence Mann guys who you acquired at the deadline, but Terrence Mann had a awful, awful contract. And just in terms of the type of production that he was bringing to the Hawks, you can look at his numbers. His numbers looked fine, but when you start watching the actual games, his impact on the floor was just not big enough for the new contract that he is about to take on. And so you were able to ship him to the Brooklyn Nets, who have the cap space to take on that contract. And then you get 1 year of Kristaps Porzingis at about $30 million a year in order to essentially prove it. He can prove it to himself, to the Hawks, maybe get a new deal moving forward, or you were able to improve your team and not lock yourself into something long term if, heaven forbid, that Kristaps' injury history pops up again and is a problem and is something that isn't able to help your team. So by giving up, Terrence Mann and George Niang, you are able to take a second round pick along with Kristaps Porzingis with that Brooklyn Nets deal. And so you do get some draft capital in return, but getting Kristaps Porzingis was clearly the biggest pressing issue that you had at that point, and it made you better. And so it was really good to see that the Hawks were able to go do that. Then draft night came up, and on draft night, you were walking into the NBA draft with the 13th overall pick, and there was a ton of options that this team could have gone. And we talked about a few of those on the last episode. Well, the Hawks decided they knew that New Orleans Pelicans wanted Derek Queen. And how did they know that? Well, it might just be because one of the new assistant GMs in Atlanta was the former GM in New Orleans. And that's Bryson Graham, a guy who had been a part of scouting Dyson Daniels and clearly had some belief in him, but was not necessarily a decision maker in New Orleans. And as Joe Dumars came in and he brought in Troy Weaver, and both Joe Dumars and Troy Weaver were of the Pistons previously, that Pistons regime that had 27 straight losses. Yeah, the Pelicans thought those were the guys to hire. So they come down and take over the Pelicans organization. And after already getting fleeced in the trade last year of DeJounte Murray going to New Orleans and the Hawks getting Dyson Daniels and that 22nd pick that I mentioned, they flipped in a part of the Kristaps Porzingis deal. The Hawks then go on draft night, take that 13th pick and say, hey, New Orleans, we know that you desperately want Derek Queen because Troy Weaver, your assistant GM, or he might be GM, but he's underneath the president of basketball ops, Joe Dumars. Troy Weaver's son was on the Maryland Terrapins coaching staff. And so clearly there was a relationship there. They were all really interested in Derek Queen, and they decide in order to get the guy that we want, we have to give something up. And so essentially, Onsi Saleh had the New Orleans Pelicans over a barrel, and that meant getting a 2026 first round pick that is the best of the Milwaukee Bucks or the New Orleans Pelicans. And I don't expect either of those teams to be particularly good, especially if things begin unfolding as they have so far in the last 24 hours, which is some things we'll get to in just a bit. But in order to make that deal, you get a 2026 first round pick, which could very likely be top 5 at the worst, top 10, because I just don't expect the Pelicans to be a good basketball team next year. And if the Bucks go and end up to an extent blowing it up and trading away Giannis Antetokounmpo, which is very, very likely, then the Bucks could have the better position. And as we just saw with this past year's draft, it doesn't even have to be the best odds to get the number 1 overall pick. I mean, the Mavericks had less than a 2% chance of landing that number 1 overall pick to get Cooper Flagg, and it still happened. So clearly, the Hawks having the best odds of the Pelicans and of the Milwaukee Bucks just really improves their odds of having a great first overall pick next year. And it's going to be fun to see how that all turns out. Once that trade was over, the Hawks were then left with a position of drafting number 23 overall, and they decided to go the Georgia kid, Asa Newell, out of the University of Georgia, someone who was able to talk to us on draft night and said, yeah, I grew up a Hawks fan because he lived in Athens until he was 10 years old, and then he moved around to Florida. But he grew up a Hawks fan. He grew up with a Cal Corver jersey, which is just crazy to me that those sorts of things can all kind of coincide together. Now, Kyle Korver did release some information that was inaccurate, saying that he was traded from the Atlanta Hawks organization for a pick that ended up turning into Kevin Huerter, and the Kevin Huerter pick then turned into 13, which then was flipped to 23 to Asa Newell. So he was trying to make the connection that Kyle Korver was directly connected to Asa Newell. However, after some research, Kevin Canard of AtlantaHawks.com was able to look it up and find out that no, it was in fact Omari Spellman. That's who was traded for Adrian Payne. It was Adrian Payne was the selection that Kyle Korver was traded for when he left the Hawks. And so those two aren't necessarily connected in that way, but they certainly are connected by the fact that Asa grew up a big Hawks fan and is able to add to this organization in hopefully a very productive way that I think, based on other moves that the Hawks have made recently, allow for that growth to happen, I think, slowly. Someone who, Asa, I expect him, as he is a bit undersized to play the 5, but as you'll see in the interview I was able to have with him at his introductory press conference, I think will be just fine for the position that he plans to play, but definitely has some size to grow into, as he's just 19 years old at that 6'8", 6'9" frame. Is someone who is very active at the rim and a strong defender. All things the Atlanta Hawks are looking to add. But as I mentioned, has that room to grow and develop as a player. Probably will spend a lot of his time in College Park, which is not always a bad thing. I know sometimes Hawks fans see a guy get drafted, then spend time in College Park and think, oh no, we blew it and the pick is not good. But as we've clearly seen from a guy like Jalen Johnson, getting to develop down in the G League system with all of those guys who are very talented coaches and have the same verbiage with Quinn Snyder and this Atlanta Hawks organization, it makes the transition very easy and very beneficial, I think, for those players. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing to see that happen. And I will be interested to see Asa's growth into a player that is able to contribute to the Atlanta Hawks on a regular basis, because I do think the qualities that he has, although he is very often talk about being that tweener type position, which sometimes struggles to find their footing in the NBA. And I think a lot of people think his ceiling is just a rotational guy. But when you're building an organization that is trying to win a championship, rotation guys and guys who know their role are so vital to your organization that not everybody has to be a star, even if that's exactly, that's what you're looking for in the draft when you're drafting guys, is the ones who blow up and turn into a big star. But having safe rotational players who do their job and do it well is vital to you as an organization. And so I think what the Atlanta Hawks have gotten in Asa Newell is really going to benefit them, on top of, as I mentioned, having that 2026 first round pick, the better of the Bucks and the Pelicans. All right. I want to get to now that conversation that I was able to have with Asa Newell at his introductory press conference. Asa is just a really fun, just interesting kind of personality type of guy. And so I think you'll see that he's going to be an exciting presence to have with this Hawks organization for quite some time. Sports Radio 92.9 The Game and the Odyssey app. It's Caleb Johnson here with the Hawks' new draft pick, Asa Newell, out of Georgia. Now, Asa, I want to start off by asking you, you are the second Georgia player to be drafted by an Atlanta team this year after we saw Jalen Walker go to the Falcons. Do you have any kind of relationship with Jalen, or been able to kind of see him at a distance? And what's that like to have a fellow Georgia guy drafted in the same city as you?
Yeah, I mean, it means a lot, seeing that, the University of Georgia is an elite athletic program and athletic school. But, my brother knows him a little bit, but, I'm ready and excited to meet him.
Yeah, now you come from the Montverde background where a lot of, you mentioned it earlier in your press conference, a lot of big stars have kind of come out of there. When did you know that guys, not only from yourself, but you see the Cooper Flags, you see the Derek Queens, when did you kind of know that you guys were building something truly special that was going to translate to the league?
Yeah, I think after we lost in our playoffs, we all made a promise to stay home. Like, we don't have to go to a school that we could average 25 at. Like, let's really hunker down. And, after like the first 3 or 4 games, it was like, hold on, we might have something really special here. And then we had an undefeated season. And, going to college, it was all our thought process to go one and done. And it's just a huge accomplishment that we were able to do that.
Now, you're a lefty, correct?
That's right.
All right. Were you handwriting everything always a lefty, or is it just the shooting stroke that kind of came that way?
Nah, everything's left-handed.
Do you have any, I know you mentioned Chris Bosh earlier being one of those guys. Do you have any other guys that you kind of remember being those lefty? Because I looked it up earlier just for you, and 9% of the NBA are lefties. Do any of those names kind of stick out that you might remember?
Isn't Jaren Jackson a lefty?
Jaren Jackson,
Yeah,
yes.
He's one of those.
Bill Russell was a lefty. It started going through the list, and like some pretty big names stick out.
Yeah.
Kobe Buffin as well, your current teammate, is also a lefty.
James Harden.
Yeah,
Yep.
James Harden as well. Did anyone try to push you towards that right side just because it's more natural for everyone else, or was that something that you just kind of always stuck with?
No, I always stuck with it, and my shooting motion's good, and everyone told me it's harder to guard a lefty, so I wanted the biggest matchup problem.
That's true. When it comes to positionally, like what you want to have translate to the NBA, kind of coming in, like the outside people will say maybe you're undersized for that center position, that 5 role. How do you kind of see your abilities and what you want to do as far as playing the 4 or the 5 or however the Hawks want to use you?
Yeah, like you said, I want to do whatever the Hawks need me to do, but I see myself as a power forward, and with the ability to play a small ball 5, depending on the matchup and depending on how we want to play, whether it's running in transition or spacing the floor. That's what I'm here to do, but I got to definitely put some size on me, and that's something I'm working on and super excited to do.
All right, well, Asa, we're super excited to have you in Atlanta, and can't wait to have many more conversations, man. Yeah, that's my conversation with Asa Newell, the Atlanta Hawks 23rd pick in the first round of this past year's NBA draft. Look, I think the sky's the limit for what Asa Newell is going to bring as far as if you are realistic with his expectations of what he can add to this team. I think year one, very, very low expectations of what he will actually add to this roster, just simply because, as he mentioned, he's still 19 years old. He's still got a younger body, a frame that he's got to build into. He's got to add muscle, and then just some of those things come with age, and it's a little bit different as far as his skill set and his abilities versus a Zachary Rizachet, who was in the same position, but just if we're being honest, the talent level that Zach brought in was higher than that of Asa Newell, and that's kind of why you see the difference there to some extent. Now, apart from drafting Asa Newell with that pick in the first round, the Atlanta Hawks then turned their attention this past start of the week into free agency, where 5 p.m. on Monday night, things started falling, and teams are snatching up players, and everything is kind of going down. And the Atlanta Hawks were a team that you weren't seeing any moves with their name attached to it, as you did see a team like a team like the Rockets, who were involved with picking up Clint Capella, that we now learn has been a sign and trade move that earns the Atlanta Hawks a second-round pick, so they get something in return for making that move happen for the Houston Rockets. We kind of knew that Clint wasn't going to come back based on how he had worked out this past season. And I mean, there was talk even before this past season that maybe he would get traded. He stuck around at the trade deadline. There was a very awkward situation where he was going through an injury, and he also had some personal things going on. He had a child that was being born, and so he stepped away from the organization, and you wondered if he was going to get moved. He didn't end up getting moved. And then the thought of him adding something to this team after that trade deadline, he came back and then ended up suffering an injury, stepping away from the team, and was gone for the rest of the year. So it was a very awkward situation towards the end of Clint Capella's time with the Atlanta Hawks, but he now gets that reunion where his NBA career began with the Houston Rockets. Another name that was, of course, attached to the Atlanta Hawks because it was a name that they surely were looking to add back to their team. Karis LeVert, he goes and signs a deal with the Detroit Pistons on what I would consider to be a pretty team-friendly deal. Like, it wasn't a ton of money being thrown Karis LeVert's way, and yet he signed it with the Pistons and not with the Hawks. And you're left thinking, well, the Hawks traded DeAndre Hunter in order to get George Niang, Karis LeVert, and those couple of second-round picks, but surely you would want to keep those players. And so I did see someone who hit me up on social media and was like, okay, so essentially you took the Bogey Bogdanovic deal that got you Terrence Mann, and you took the DeAndre Hunter deal. You combined those two players, and you got back Kristaps Porzingis. In a roundabout way, sure. But I think you were really looking at the contract that DeAndre Hunter was on and wanting to get off of that, and just not really seeing, especially with his injury history, not seeing that as something you wanted to be attached to long term. And so that's why you cut bait with that deal when you did. And so it's difficult because I know fans, and I even tweeted about it, the fact that it looks like, oh, the two guys that you traded for, you then traded away or lost in free agency, as you did with Karis LeVert. And so what are you really left with after the DeAndre Hunter trade? Well, I think you're left with a much freer cap space situation, which is going to give you a lot of options in the future to add talent. And you got away from a player that had high upside when available, but I think it just kind of run its course as far as his relationship with the Atlanta Hawks organization, and him wanting to look to potentially, be somewhere else. And I think everyone's happier after the split and kind of move on from there. But when Monday came and you saw Clint go, and you saw Karis go, and you saw some other names that were attached to the Atlanta Hawks potentially, your Sam Hausers, your Ty Jeromes, your Dennis Schroeders, like all of these names started bing, just going, getting out of here, being gone. Then you started to wonder, okay, well, it seems like the name that had been floated around the most with the Atlanta Hawks was Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Surely that's the guy that they want to go get. And yes, that is eventually the deal that the Atlanta Hawks make, as they go and get Nickeil Alexander-Walker on a 4-year deal. So he is someone that they want to have around long term, and give him a nice chunk of change, $62 million overall. We're not sure exactly how that contract is set up just yet, but that's somewhere in the neighborhood of $15.5 million a year. And that is quite the upward swing for Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who was making just $4.5 million with the Minnesota Timberwolves. But with the Timberwolves having to pay some of their big players like Naz Reid and like Julius Randle, that gave an opening for the Atlanta Hawks to go out and make a deal like this happen. Not long after going to get Nickeil Alexander-Walker, we then find out that the Atlanta Hawks had signed a free agent, Luke Canard. This is a guy from the Grizzlies, one of the best three-point shooters in the NBA. That is statistically, when it comes to the fact that he has been the highest three-point percentage shooter, 45.5% over the last 5 seasons. And he does that at a really high clip. Like, as far as it's about 10 attempts per 100 possessions. It's a very nerdy way of saying he shoots threes a lot in games, and he makes a lot of those threes. And I did see some online discussion of, okay, well, the Atlanta Hawks essentially just went out and got a more expensive Garrison Matthews. And I don't think that's the case. I think they got a more talented player, just quite honestly, in his ability to shoot the ball, but also handle the rock. Because something that's going to be very important for this Atlanta Hawks organization this year is getting Trey to not spend so much time as the primary ball handler, but also just not on the floor altogether, I think, as much as we've seen the usage rate that Trey's had and the minutes that he's played over the last few seasons just kind of climb up and up and up and up. And I think by acquiring a guy like Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who is also in his own right a very good three-point shooter, but also a really, really strong perimeter defender, that is something that the Atlanta Hawks, I think, needed to add to, because you do have Dyson Daniels, but just because you have Dyson doesn't mean that the buck needs to stop there. To have someone who can come off the bench and provide additional defensive support, or just matchup wise, not even necessarily just has to be with the bench, but you can play a lot around with lineups, I believe, in order to get matchups that are really strong for you defensively. But then, as I mentioned, Nickeil Alexander-Walker brings the offensive aspect as well, for him to be able to contribute to this team. Luke Canard, someone who, yeah, he's not the greatest defender. That's like, there's no reason to kind of hide that sort of thing, or talk around it. It certainly is something that you have to kind of manage and figure out and strategize of how you want to handle that. I would assume he's not going to be on the floor a whole lot with Trae Young. Certainly wouldn't make a whole lot of sense there. But he is someone who has ball handling abilities, and so whether you want to run small lineups with potentially having Dyson Daniels handle the rock and Luke Canard as a potential shooting option, whether you want to make Luke a potential point guard option to handle the ball, or whether you really will move forward with Kobe Buffin in that potential point guard role, as he was brought into this organization. Really thought he kind of started to show the tendency of being more of a two guard. And I heard a lot of the discussions around Kobe being in that light. But if the Hawks need him in a different role, I'm sure he'll be fine handling that. And the Hawks have a lot of expectations because they did draft him after all. So you would like to see your draft pick turn into something. And so far, the only thing he's turned into at this point has been an injury liability. And so you want to give him that additional opportunity this next season. It appears, at least, that's what the Hawks want to do, and give him that opportunity and see how that works out. I do think for Hawks fans, you have to be realistic about your expectations of addressing needs, because so far the Atlanta Hawks have addressed a ton of needs. They added size through drafting, and then through drafting Asa Newell and then acquiring Kristaps Porzingis. But then through free agency, through sign and trade, getting Nickeil Alexander-Walker, getting Luke Canard, they addressed shooting issues that they had, as well as upgrading their defense on the bench. And these are a lot of things that make this team a lot better. They still have a need, I believe, at that 3 position, at that forward position, and as well at the big role, because you did let Dom Barlow go. You decided not to exercise that option for him this upcoming season. And then we just learned earlier in the day on Tuesday that Larry Nance Jr. is going to the Cleveland Cavaliers. He is someone that I thought might sign a vet minimum deal with the Atlanta Hawks, but he has decided to go back to the Cleveland Cavaliers, a team that he spent some time with. And that means you've got a hole right now that you're going to be trying to fill. I had seen some names pop up that certainly would be interesting as to whether or not the Hawks would want to add. I know my buddy Glenn Willis had mentioned Mo Wagner is out there, as the Orlando Magic decided not to bring him back. Al Horford is certainly a name that's going to be on the market, but you have to wonder about as far as the type of money that he's going to want, and then picking a team. Does he want to go back to the Hawks, or will he want to go out west to a team like the Lakers? Thomas Bryant, who's coming off of it, almost winning a championship, getting so close. Game 7, he was with the Indiana Pacers. Is he a name that you want to bring back? Alex Len, certainly someone that the Hawks have experience with. At this point in his career, is he kind of that low-level center, that third option off the bench? Precious Achua is certainly going to be an option, as well as Jackson Hayes, someone who at one point was rumored to be in a Lakers deal that was going to involve Trae Young. It was a very silly thing a while back, but so certainly there are some options available to the Atlanta Hawks in order to get that third center. Would have loved, honestly, for it to have been a guy like Larry Nance Jr., who, because of the injuries that he suffered this past season, really didn't get to fully show what he could bring to this team. The most important thing that he brought was his off-the-court ability, his veteran leadership, and all of that sort of thing to help out a young locker room that I thought he did a really good job with. Him and George specifically, those were 2 guys that I think handled the veteran responsibilities of a locker room really well with the Atlanta Hawks, as Trae Young of course, did as well, and kind of blossomed into a different leadership role. But those guys kind of handle those things more naturally. Unfortunately, they're no longer a part of this team. And so you are going to be leaning on Trae Young more as a leader in this team. And it is interesting to see in all of the reports going on with the signing of Nickeil Alexander-Walker, as well as going to get Luke Canard, that those were both CAA clients and shared an agent with Trae Young. And so all of the reports were that Trae Young was very active in those discussions of recruiting those guys to the team. We've heard of Trae doing this in the past, as he tried to get DeJounte Murray and eventually did get him there. That one didn't particularly work out, but it is always good to see that your team's star player is actively recruiting players and eventually getting them to come and join your organization. So hopefully we see that kind of continue on. Now, one of the things that I wanted to get into over the course of this podcast, as we kind of wrap this thing up and get towards a close, is the thing I am most concerned about with the Atlanta Hawks heading into this upcoming season is expectations, because the expectations have changed for this team. This is a team that finished 9th in the Eastern Conference a year ago. We're fighting for their lives. Now, obviously, Jalen Johnson was not a part of that team, and there was a lot of different pieces kind of moving around. Injuries certainly played a part in the Hawks finishing ultimately where they did. But acquiring Kristaps Porzingis, going out and getting Nickeil Alexander-Walker, getting a guy and a dominant three-point shooter like Luke Canard, adding him to this roster that already has Trae Young, that already has Dyson Daniels, that already has Onyeka Okongwu, Zachary Riza-Shea in year 2, and hopefully a healthy Jalen Johnson. All of these things have changed the expectations nationally about the Atlanta Hawks. They've gone from a team that was forgotten and discussed only when it came to, hey, let's trade for Trae Young. And now they're being discussed as a potential top team in the Eastern Conference. It makes me extremely uncomfortable because I don't necessarily know that the Hawks have handled expectations so well in the past. I mean, if you remember, this is a team that, coming from the Mike Budenholzer days of when you were competing in the East, you were getting to those conference finals, and you were ultimately getting knocked out by LeBron James, that you were not really you weren't following up those years with great results. You were kind of lesser and lesser each year. You went from conference finals to the conference semis to getting bounced out of the first round to following that in a dead period. Then you get back with Lloyd Pierce in a disastrous season, quite honestly, in that 2020 year, that saw you acquire talent the way that the Hawks did this year, but that talent wasn't working out early on. You cut ties with Lloyd Pierce. You bring in Nate McMillan, who was that lead assistant. He does run you to eventually making it to the conference finals again, where you're knocked out by the Bucks, and eventually you go into that offseason where the thought was, well, we're just going to bring everybody back that help us get to this point instead of trying to get better. Those expectations and all of that was met with getting bounced out of the playoffs by the Miami Heat the next season. You then follow that up with a pretty disappointing year with Nate McMillan, where he gets fired, and then you bring in Quinn Snyder, but expectations are then low at that point because he's a new head coach, and you get bounced out by the Boston Celtics. You've then followed that up by a couple of years in a row of getting knocked out of the play-in. And just, I worry about expectations for this team, as I was recently asked, where could the Atlanta Hawks organization end up in the regular season? And I don't know that this has necessarily been, at least to this point, this has not been a good regular season team. And so expectations, sure, you could be the third best team in the Eastern Conference, because I think the New York Knicks are still going to be up there as a dominant team. I think the Cleveland Cavaliers, as far as a regular season team, are still going to be in that conversation. I do think, like, even though Boston is taking a backseat by selling off talent and eventually, like, obviously this past season, or this upcoming season, I should say, not having Jason Tatum, I still don't know that they're going to take an absolute backseat in the entire conference. I certainly do think the Indiana Pacers do, because you have no Tyrese Halliburton, and you did lose Miles Turner as he signed a deal, and kind of shocked a lot of different people with his ultimate destination of going to the Milwaukee Bucks. But the Bucks, who were a team potentially up in this mix, if they have Giannis, decided to release Damian Lillard and stretch out his contract over the next, I believe, 5 seasons. And apparently that upset Giannis Antetokounmpo. He potentially could ask out. So, is there a trade scenario in which the Atlanta Hawks could acquire Giannis Antetokounmpo? It's possible. It's certainly there. The framework is there. You'd be giving up a lot of draft picks. You'd be giving up Jalen Johnson, probably Onyeka Okongwu as well, if not more players. But the framework is certainly there. But I think the expectations, even before doing some kind of blockbuster deal like that, are sky high for this Hawks team. And it concerns me because I do not think that the Hawks have handled expectations particularly well in the past. And with a Detroit Pistons team that's getting better, an Orlando Magic team that's gotten better in this offseason, there are a lot of teams that are going to be up in the mix. And I think the Hawks are certainly amongst that mix, but they haven't shown us so far that they're a good regular season team. And I think at this point, they're going to have to prove it to us. So I know some people believe them to be, and I even mentioned that they have the potential to be a top 3 team. But let's go from a team that was 9th in the East a year ago and say, let's just simply make the playoffs without having to be in the play-in round. Let's leave the Chicago Bulls, the Miami Heat in the past, and not be in that play-in type of scenario, and find yourself 5th or 6th in the East. And I think you will look back on this as a successful run, especially if you're able to get to the second round of the playoffs. That's the part that I'm more paying attention to, is whether or not the Hawks are a top 2 or 3 team in the East. I think unlikely and also not incredibly important. But whether or not the Hawks are able to advance past the first round into the second round, I think that is where they are going to measure their success far more than anything else. That's going to do it for my time here on Atlanta basketball with Caleb Johnson. Please make sure to tell your friends, tell your family, tell your enemies, tell anyone about this podcast. Give it a follow. And as always, do all of the rating, the subscribing, the fun nitty gritty stuff, as I mentioned at the top, that gets me all of the thumbs up from my bosses. But for my time here on Atlanta basketball with Caleb Johnson, you guys take care, and we'll talk again next week.